Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today we are going to talk about what the coronavirus pandemic is doing to not just stock markets around the world, but the global economy. Now, there are some extraordinary measures that are being taken at the moment by various countries. To get further insight on whether these are temporary measures or that they are going to have a positive long-term effect, we'll be talking to our analyst. Let me introduce who we have today with us. We have with us Mr. Einar Tangen joining us from Beijing as an analyst. We also have with us Dr. Usman Chohan, an economist and director of economics and national affairs at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. He's joining us from Islamabad. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start with you, Mr. Tangen. A lot of countries, Australia, the US, European countries are all taking extraordinary measures. But let's focus on China here at the moment. They have talked about raising $400 billion in bonds, and they're also, unexpectedly by some analysts, have kept their interest rates quite steady. Is this as unexpected as analysts are saying it is?
Well, quite frankly, it's not done yet. What you have is China is reacting on a kind of wait-and-see basis, to see what kind of effects some of the moves that they're making are. They reduced IRR. They put off taxes on small, medium-sized enterprises. They're encouraging banks to lend out and things like that. But it might come down to this kind of helicopter money situation where they have to put funds in the hands of individuals. Because quite frankly, it's been a long time, a long 2 months. They're anxious to get the consumption engine started again. And in order to do that, people have to feel confident that there would be money in their pockets. They also this would be helpful to small and medium-sized enterprises because they could be relieved of their of their obligation to pay their labor costs. That would be very important. There's also this idea about stopping the clock, the financial clock, allowing individuals and companies to put off repaying loans for a period of 3-6 months, depending on what they see as necessary. So don't judge it now based on everything that's going to happen. This is simply the beginning of how they're looking at the problem. Well, unfortunately, it's a little bit more complicated than that because what you have is a situation where you don't know how long the COVID-19 will continue. There are two basic strategies going on in the world. There's containment. That's best exemplified in China. You've seen it in South Korea and to a certain extent in Singapore. Then you have this amelioration. Amelioration means that you're basically trying to flatten out the curve of people getting the virus so that you can match up their medical needs with your existing infrastructure. It's thought that this, although it will cost more lives, will in essence have a lesser economic impact. So until we know exactly how these countries are dealing with the virus and how successful we are, it's a little bit premature to know what exactly their economic moves will mean. It could be too little, too much, too late. We don't know. Now, China, on the other hand, this containment strategy of whatever is necessary to contain the virus, they're stepping into new ground. They're the first ones to emerge. They were the first ones in, first ones to emerge. And now they're trying to figure out exactly how they do that without adding massive amounts of debt to an already very, very highly charged debt situation. Remember, the U.S. and China have about the same amount of debt. The difference is where it is located. The U.S., it's located mostly in the government side. In China, it's mostly on the private sector side.
Right. So, okay, Dr. Chohan, let's get your take on this from the U.S. perspective. How do you see the Federal Reserve's emergency move to slash key interest rates to near zero? How is this going to affect global markets?
I think that the monetary side with reducing the interest rates is fine, but it won't be the biggest chunk of the stimulus element. The biggest chunk will be the fiscal side. And with that, you have the Feds and the Treasury trying to coordinate a large package. The issue is in Congress. So the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has said that they have up to $4 trillion in liquidity. But what that means is that the Fed would be handling or shouldering about 2.5 out of that 4 trillion. Another would be a 0.5 trillion package that would be from Congress. And that's where most of the dispute is happening. The Democrats aren't happy with that because they think it gives a preferential treatment to large businesses, as opposed to, as my colleague said, getting money into people's pockets. So that's where the dispute is happening. And the remainder will come from the Treasury backstopping, which means that they would put around 10 billion, and that would allow for the multiplier of about the remainder being lent out with that as the backstop for that additional lending. That should be up $4 trillion, and that is a large amount. It's unprecedented, but given the kind of forecasting we've seen from the Federal Reserve St. Louis branch, you are expecting about $2.5 trillion loss from everything that is stopping. Now, that's one of the more negative assessments, but it's quite possibly a realistic one, given how bad things are. Absolutely. They've had a very good run. It was largely commodity driven. And then that was in the 90s and the 2000s, and that was exporting commodities to China largely. They tried to diversify into things such as tourism and education. All of these sectors are obviously cyclical and impacted by what's happening in the world. The government there is now offering up to $250,000 in loans to small businesses. It could be up to let's say, a massive number in terms of the overall stimulus. But what they're trying to do is get the small business as the avenue and conduit for stimulating the economy. What you've seen there is also a larger disregard for the contagion element. You saw 20,000 people on Bondi Beach in Sydney. So I think there's a big problem with public messaging there. And to signal that, I think bigger quantities of money are part of the overall signaling effort in terms of an island that is, remote, and the movement of people is also a big issue there. It's very flight dependent, even in between cities inside Australia. So they have a certain different dynamic, and having a different kind of stimulus program might be necessary to get the public awareness and the kind of stimulus they're looking for.
So the balance is critical here. There are going to be many approaches the countries will have to take on. Mr. Tangen, very quickly, last question from you. Smaller economies like Indonesia, Taiwan, the Philippines, how are they faring in handling this very complicated situation?
Their health infrastructure isn't up to it, and quite frankly, neither the finances. This week, the G20 will be meeting virtually. It's very important that these countries who represent 90% of the world's GDP take a leadership position, not only to take care of their own problems, but to remember that there's a whole world out there and that they have a responsibility to act it. And it's not just responsibility. If they fail to do this, disease and the economic consequences could go on for a much longer period and do more damage, not only to the world's economy, but their own. Easing lending is at a time when you don't have people buying. All the money you could borrow is just putting you further into debt. So that's one of the things that China is very aware of. The UK is also doing some helicopter money. They're trying to push money. They say they're going to cover anybody who is out because of the COVID-19. So that's one way of keeping consumption somewhat on a steady footing. But the fact is, all of these shops everywhere is closed, sporting events, etc. This is a huge impact to economies that are really about 80% choice. It's not necessity. About 20% of Britain's and U.S. advanced countries, their GDP, 20% goes to necessities. The rest is just the things that we want. And if you're not buying that, that has a very serious effect on the economy.
Until then, Dr. Usman, let me get to you on this point also. You talked about this delicate balance that is important to achieve in order to get the right approach, because excessive funds in the market would do, the helicopter money, as you called it, would have a sort of counter effects. In your opinion, how is Taiwan, Philippines, and smaller economies doing? Are they also looking at the approach that Pakistan has?
Yes, but the differences in fiscal space in the modern world are quite significant. And because of that, different countries have different room to maneuver. It's quite easy to conjure up 4 trillion where it's just a 10 billion backstop on 1 trillion and so on. But as far as the emerging markets go, they have much less room to maneuver, but they tend to have larger populations. They tend to have weaker infrastructure. And so there is a legitimate notion of debt forgiveness at this time on the deflationary side. So you're taking haircuts on the debt. That's one part of it. Austerity would be unpalatable. That's another deflationary element. And then on the inflationary side, helicopter money would go. But helicopter money also depends on the relationship of your currencies to others. So that's why you'll have, if you start to go on the helicopter money route in a weak currency, you'll start to see massive runs on your, you'd see basically the contagion from the equity markets going into other financial assets, specifically your currency. And that shows us the kind of interrelationship between the modern economy's moving parts, that any country trying to rescue its own people or its own economy must take into consideration the larger repercussions of those decisions on other countries. Because of the imbalances, this is a very difficult thing to strike, and it's a particularly delicate year with the elections in the United States, so they get votes from their American electorate, but their impacts will be on other countries. So as far as global response goes, we have to look at the local and the global at the same time with imbalances among countries.
And one of the sort of offshoots to the global economic effects of COVID-19 is the right now oil price war that is going on between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And it seems in this game between these two, the US has blinked first. Tell us a little about what President Trump's decision has essentially done.
What's important about the oil markets to realize is that there is a tug of war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. It's very significant because there's a glut anticipated because there's just not enough consumption, particularly airlines have been grounded, transportation is being limited, movement of people. And so you have a glut of supply, and at the same time, the producers are trying to determine the price because they could not come to an accord via OPEC and Russia. The large fracking companies in the United States are sort of caught in the middle. Now, their size and their pricing power and all of that is limited compared to the juggernauts of Russia and Saudi Arabia, but they are still an important player. So having that kind of support from the federal government in the U.S. will be necessary, but that's where the competition between Republicans and Democrats for votes comes in, because the Republican approach right now, particularly the 0.5 trillion element out of the 4 trillion that comes through Congress, is, according to the Democrats, largely favored towards large businesses. It's very much disfavoring the poor, and the Democrats want more of the money to go to hospitals and things like that, directly into the pockets of the poor. That sort of tussle leaves a larger stimulus program out of the wake. So what I'm trying to say is that the oil price, as far as companies in America go, oil companies and specifically, it's also tied into the local politics and the local economic people trying to manage the macroeconomy, because what you have is that people, well, if they're spending about 20% worth of the economy's size on necessities, then that's all you really needed in these kinds of crisis situations. But the rest of it generates so much employment, so many financial assets are linked or derived from them, that what we have as the benchmark of our economy in terms of stock market indices or bond market yields, those are far more cyclical, and that is a very big scary element of all this. As far as China's response versus the United States, there are different strategies involved in it, both in terms of amelioration and contagion, as was mentioned. But the other thing is that I'm particularly worried about developing countries that don't have the backstops or this kind of fiscal space to cope with this. That's why, for example, in countries such as Pakistan, they're talking about debt forgiveness as an important part of the element of the restructuring. Now, that debt restructuring element or getting a haircut on debt would be important on the deflationary side. But at the same time, on the inflationary side, that printing money or helicopter money, as said before, is very important. And striking that important balance will be part of this short-term deleveraging we'll see as far as the markets go.
Let me welcome another voice in this conversation. We have with us Miss Vicky Pryce. She's joining us from London. She's an economist. Welcome to the show, Miss Pryce. We're essentially talking about how President Trump's intervention in this oil war between Russia and the US could have possibly impacted oil prices, which are now showing a record climb.
Well, it's a real problem for the US, of course, because it has become self-dependent on and reliant on oil. It doesn't actually need to necessarily export and import, but of course it doesn't necessarily produce the right type of oil and gas it needs, so there's an awful lot of movement in and out of the country. But obviously, as prices fall, its own production becomes uneconomic, and that's a big issue, possibly becomes uneconomic if it carries on like this. And of course, the US has already got other problems, as we know. So a number of states are shutting down. Production is declining in a number of areas. And the forecast overall for growth, that's not just in terms of shale oil now. We're talking about forecast for growth of the economy as a whole, are pretty gloomy. And there are people who think that maybe in the next quarter we'll see falls in GDP of possibly 20%, if not more. And the question is when it's all going to recover. So obviously, the sector, the oil and gas sector, is one which is very significant for the US right now. And if that adds to the problems that the government has and needs to move in and support loads of firms in that sector, then obviously the stimulus package that we're expecting to come out of the US may need to incorporate that too. What's happening is that there are some countries, like China, strangely enough, which are beginning to show some signs of growth again, where some of the restrictions have been taken away. But in reality, what is happening right now is that the rest of the world, certainly in the West and Europe in particular, but also increasingly in the States and elsewhere, whether we're looking at South America, we're looking also at Africa, the restrictions are intensifying, and the concerns about the impact of the coronavirus are becoming more global, and what people are worried about specifically is how long it will all last. But certainly a number of the monetary measures that central banks have put in place have been certainly welcomed by firms, and we're seeing also the willingness, if you like, of governments that wouldn't have done that before, of intervening directly in terms of taking stakes possibly in particular sectors and helping out over that period and helping the employees of the sector. So there is at least some coordinated movement there. But whether that means that growth is going to resume at any point in the sort of short term, I think that's not the case.
That's not the game. But Dr. Chohan, I'm curious to know what your take on this is. Is this going to be 2020 is going to be the year where governments across the world are going to sign off that this is not going to be a year of growth considering this pandemic? The main aim will be for not just central banks, but like the G20 to keep economies afloat.
It's a difficult question because there are two countervailing forces. On one hand, you have the desire to keep fetishizing growth and have strong GDP. That culture is under attack because there's a strong argument for degrowth with more economical sustainability, ecological sustainability, and a Green New Deal is becoming an interesting conversation in the United States. It's already existed in Europe. So as part of the transition goes towards something more sustainable, I think this is a more opportune time than any to reconsider the fundamentals of our economic architecture. But whether it happens depends on how well the vested interests in capitalism survive. So that depends in part on the kinds of stimuluses that the United States and other countries give. So if you get a Republican model stimulus, you'd likely get the big corporations continuing with business as usual. If you get a more Democrat-oriented or something even beyond that, then you might have things such as civil society strengthening. You have a more manageable growth, more ecological sustainability. And it's not just political parties. It's more about civil society itself. So you're seeing big shifts in the demographics of the world. You see a disproportionate impact on elderly people from COVID. You see different kinds of dynamics playing out. But 2020 is unlikely to be a strong year from growth. The Federal Reserve, St. Louis, predicts that it'll be a 50% drop quarter on quarter in Q2. And so that should play out into a larger decline. I mean, the global GDP is unlikely to exceed plus 1% year-on-year growth at the end of the fiscal year, calendar year 2020.
All right, well, we've run out of time here. Ms. Vicky Pryce, Dr. Usman Chohan, a very good, interesting conversation with both of you. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire. We will take a quick short break here. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, these are extraordinary times, and extraordinary times might also spur on extraordinary events. We have been seeing the US-Iran tensions bubbling in the past year, and it has been a painful experience for Iranians especially, who have also now been hit as one of the worst countries to be hit by the pandemic, COVID-19. What we're essentially looking to discuss here, that while in the backdrop we are seeing a prisoner swap taking place, most significantly happening between a jailed French researcher in Iran and in return they released an Iranian, and whether there's a possibility that tensions could de-escalate at this very extraordinary time. So let me introduce our panel of experts here. We have with us Ms. Zahra Tohidian. She's a journalist. She's also an editor-in-chief of Parsi Policy, the Persian Analysis on International Affairs, and she's joining us today from Tehran. We also have with us Mr. Van Meguerditchian. He's a journalist and an analyst, and he's joining us today from Paris. Welcome to both of you to the program. Most specifically, we want to begin here, Ms. Zahra, with Iran having released a French researcher. And it seems like there is this prisoner swap that has taken place where an Iranian has also been freed. Now, he was just a little while ago was being threatened with extradition. Now, considering these extraordinary times, tell us a little more about what you understand from this prisoner swap.
Yes, on Friday we had a very good news coming from France. In a very extraordinary move, the France government resisted U.S. request that was asking to hand over an Iranian national who was arrested by the request of U.S. government more than a year ago on charges of violating sanctions. I followed the news that the France government was asked to hand over the Iranian nationals to the U.S. government, but fortunately, it was in a very extraordinary move. The France government decided not to, and the Iranian researcher was handed over to Iran on Friday. Well, in response, Iran also freed a France national who was arrested in Iran almost a year ago and was sentenced by court to 5 years in prison on some grounds of national security grounds.
So coming to you, Mr. Van, and your take on this is not the only prisoner swap that has taken place after the pandemic has hit full scale. We have seen on Friday a U.S. Navy veteran was released also. Now, what do you make of it? Is this a softening of the kind of stance both countries had taken between each other, the U.S. and Iran?
Well, the Americans have been speaking with Iranians through Swiss authorities. The Swiss mediators have been trying to find a new diplomatic channel that the administration in Washington wants to establish, to have direct or indirect talks with Iran regarding several issues, whether that would be a new nuclear deal, or that would be about liberating, freeing American prisoners who are currently detained in Iran. So what we saw is that the Swiss authorities succeeded in securing the liberation, at least, to have him in some kind of a house arrest in Tehran with the Swiss authorities, who's a former U.S. Navy veteran, Michael White. So Michael White has been released. At the same time, another American citizen, a dual national, a Lebanese American citizen, was released also in the same week by the Lebanese authorities, and he was he flew directly on board the U.S. military helicopter back home to the United States. Both Michael White and Amr al-Fakouri, who was in Lebanon, they were both sick. They were both suffering from an illness. Their health conditions were deteriorating. So they pleaded with the Iranian authorities with the help of the Swiss to secure their release. Now both are Amr al-Fakouri is with his family in the United States. Michael White is staying in Tehran for the moment, but it's an opening door. It's a new door to a diplomacy that would probably open other doors to talk about the nuclear issue and Iran's involvement in Iraq.
It's an interesting situation here, Ms. Zahra, if I could come to you here on this point that Iran is releasing these citizens, these dual nationals. Last week they released Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe, an aid worker with a UK dual nationality. She's been released for 2 weeks, even though she is to stay within Iran. There is also demands coming in of a US citizen, Siamak Namazi, who was convicted for charges of espionage and collaboration to throw over the government. But the question I'm looking to get your opinion on is this the kind of leverage that Iran is ready to give up?
Well, a new chapter by Iran and U.S. I guess Iran has always been open to work with U.S., but the U.S. government has always been trying to, as they say, to increase the pressure on Iran. we have not seen any kind of movement by the U.S. government, but more sanctions and sanctions. You know that in coronavirus crisis that it has hit the country, the U.S. government has increased the sanctions recently. So we are not seeing any positive signs from the U.S. government here. But as the Rouhani government has always expressed, they are willing to cooperate with any government in the world as long as they are showing good intentions, which we are not seeing from the Trump government at all.
So, Mr. Van, this approach that U.S. continues to maximize pressure on Iran, the increase of sanctions, what is the nature of these sanctions? How are they hurting Iran?
There are two elements in this. On the one hand, the Trump administration wants to continue with the maximum pressure on the Iranians, on the Iranian regime. This maximum pressure is hurting Iran's economy, is hurting the Iranian people, it's hurting the regime, it's hurting Iran's influence in the region. But nevertheless, on the other side of the Atlantic, you have the European countries who are trying to engage in a diplomacy with the Iranians and try to have a different route with Iran, contrary to what the Americans are doing. So, well, there's this diplomacy channels that were opened between the Europeans, especially the French, with the Iranian regime. But in every diplomacy, there is, unfortunately, there is a war. In every diplomacy, there is a battle, and in those battles, there are collateral damages. Roland Marshall, a senior researcher on Africa, who I happen to know and I worked with several years ago in Paris, he's a very respected researcher on Africa. He was during the diplomacy, during the French opening and easing of the Iranian regime, he was detained along with his partner in Tehran on charges of espionage. And Roland Marshall, everybody knows him. He's well respected in the academic circles, especially in Paris. He's well known around the world. He was detained as these talks with Iran were going on. So it's a tricky situation. The French, on the one hand, are trying to open up to the Iranians.
But Mr. Van, the U.S., they've come out criticizing very harshly the release of this Iranian by France.
Yes, the Americans are criticizing the French because there is an agreement between the U.S. and France to extradite prisoners, especially when the detained individual is wanted by the U.S. Justice Department. A French court agreed to the extradition of Mr. Jalal back to the United States, but the French Supreme Court overrided it and preferred to use it because the French had a French national detained in Iran, so they needed some leverage. And in some way, the Americans are right to criticize the French, to say you are in a way using our maximum pressure, and at the same time disagreeing with us. But at the end of the day, you have also interests in Iran that you need to secure. And if the Americans had not asked the French to detain Jalal Ruhollah Najat in France, the French didn't have a lot of cards to play to ensure the release of Roland Marshall from the prison in Iran.
It's an interesting dynamic playing out here because there have been a lot of criticism on the US for continuing these tensions. Zahra, the new sanctions imposed on Iran, they must be getting in the way on the government fighting COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, before that, I want to point out two very important issues. First of all, this French national, Roland Marshall, was arrested in Iran and was sentenced according to the Constitution of the Islamic Republic to the 5 years in prison based on the evidence. But the Iranian nationals are arrested around the world based on the charges the U.S. government of violating sanctions. So it is not the France government that is arresting Iranian because he has done any crimes. It is simply because France is a U.S. ally, and the U.S. is accusing everyone, every Iranian national who is working abroad, of violating sanctions, whether in France, whether in Germany, whether in Australia, and asking every government, every ally in the Europe to hand those people back to the U.S. government. And the second point is that our friend has said that the European countries are working with Iran. Actually, that's not the case. An Iranian official just recently revealed that Iran purchased masks and so medical equipment from UK government before the coronavirus hit the country. But the UK government refrained from delivering the package. So the US allies are working with the US to pressure Iran as much as they can. The so-called sweet channel is too slow. So we are facing the lack of medical equipment here very badly.
Very badly. And this is a critical time for Iranians, as it is not just a dwindling economy, but now a lack of medical equipment. Unfortunately, we've run out of time here. I just want to thank you, Ms. Zahra, Mr. Van, for joining us in this conversation. It's the end of the program, but tomorrow we'll be back with more news and analysis. Till then, goodbye.